We come to the silver medal celebration, and it was established actually in 2008 to highlight distinguished contributions to the development of metrology in Europe. And this award is presented actually annually. And this year, the prize has been awarded to Michel Jarraud, Secretary General Emeritus of the WMO. No? No? Yes, it's okay. We always have that problem. No? Thank you. Because we will first have the laudatio, but we already can see what it looks like. But you are not getting it just now, you're getting it a little bit later. We have the laudatio by Ivan Kacic, who is actually the president of the Regional Association 6 Europe in the WMO. And you're also the permanent representative of Croatia to the WMO. Okay.
Thank you
so
very much.
You may, of course, use the floor. You don't need to keep the microphone in your hand. Okay, so we have the laudatio, then you will get your prize, and then we will ask you to do something.
Timing is extremely important. I wonder if it's working. Yes, it is working. So, dear Mr. EMS President, Dr. Horst Berger, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm highly appreciative to the European Meteorological Society to having chosen Mr. Michel Jarraud as laureate of the EMS Silver Medal for 2016. I'm also deeply honored by the EMS invitation to act as a contributor to this ceremony. Indeed, Michel, it is my privilege and pleasure to express my appreciation and gratitude to you on behalf of Regional Association 6 Europe or the World Meteorological Organization for your prosperous and productive missions in the field of meteorology, hydrology, and related disciplines in science, scientific applications, and capacity development in the WMO and EMS community. We are very proud of the milestones you have achieved at the WMO through your 3 mandates as the WMO Secretary General, as well as taking into consideration your previous successful assignment as the WMO Deputy Secretary General. This has all happened in the last 20 years in the extremely dynamic, complex, and demanding environment in science, technology, politics, and economics. So, Michel Jarraud has changed many challenges, has faced many challenges. It's a miraculous technological innovation combined with inevitable psychological adjustment that accompanies such dynamic and unpredictable periods. Rising risks of natural disasters reflecting in high impact of weather, storms, floods, and droughts as symptoms of a changing climate due to the evident anthropogenic influence. Escalating demands from governments, institutions, and citizens for more useful and reliable information. Demands for products and services to optimize socio-economic benefits as well as to mitigate and adapt to high-impact weather, marine weather, and climate and hydrological extremes. Implementation of programs and projects initiatives to meet the broad global societal needs of fundamental importance to the and to contribute to the global sustainable development agenda. Amazingly, Michel, you have successfully responded to such challenges with the WMO zero nominal economic growth budget, so I congratulate to you. It is no coincidence that Michel Jarraud has achieved so many professionally results. It is evident that the response of Mr. Jarraud to these challenges was secured by his personal investment, extraordinary leadership, knowledgeable and hardworking nature, qualities that were evident well before his role as the WMO Secretary General. We could clearly witness that his career has been fully devoted to meteorology, starting even from when he was very, very young, and actually when he was born in September 2052. I'm proud that we are the same year born. When Michel was just 6 months old, his birthplace hit wind gusts over 150 kilometers per hour. His parents immediately recognized that he decided to become a meteorologist. So this year, 1952, had indeed some special meteo events. Great London Smog, a 24-hour rainfall record on 1,880 millimeters in La Réunion, and also, surprise, surprise, the first issue of WMO Bulletin. I believe that the most valuable meteorological trophy is Michel's weather diary, with his regular weather observations that included temperature, rainfall, wind, and cloudiness from November 1961 to December 1964. Am I right? Good dates. So shifting forward to his mature age in research, Mr. Giraud has played an important role in development of the numerical weather prediction hemispheric spectral model, firstly in Meteo France, then in ECMWMF, where he took a significant part in the development and introduction into operations of the ECWMF spectral model and the comparison with the operational grid point model. He also played a vital role in building the methodology validating operational changes and more generally for associating research and operational teams. In operations, Mr. Giraud was the successful director of National Forecasting Division in Meteo France, with a significant responsibility for general aeronautical and marine forecasting, including early warnings of extreme events, just to mention highly successful forecasts and warnings by Meteo France for the 15 and 16 October 1987 Great Storm, which was one of the strongest storms that hit UK and France. During his mandate, Michel also initiated and led the development of a workstation for the forecasters. We know all for Synergy, and it's now in use in more than 60 countries. His leadership continued to shine when he became the head of operations and deputy director of ECMWMF. It is amazing that every year Michel hosted at his home a buffet for the ECMWMF Technical Advisory Committee members, which became an important element of information negotiations, for example, for supercomputer acquisition. So, as the WMO Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Giraud was engaged in several vital activities and achievements such as supervision of technical departments, the creation of WMO DRR program and space program, the creation of ISDR and membership of its management oversight board, strong, but not to say fanatic, commitment to materialize construction project of the magnificent WMO headquarters building in Geneva, thus completed what is important on time and within costs. It is really a very, very high achievement. Among numerous events, Mr. Giraud proactively participated in several weather festivals, including 13 International Weather Festival in Zagreb, in my country, in 2003. And yes, Michel, I clearly remember when we met then. More than that, I'm still amazed with your statement about weather modification, in particular to the hail suppression activity. Surprisingly, after 13 years, it matches the WMO statement of weather modification proposed by the Commission of Atmospheric Sciences this year at the WMO Executive Council. Your video statement is still a voice of balanced knowledge, wisdom, and diplomacy in this highly sensitive area where operations declared as activities based on science have many gray levels. Thank you for that, Michel. For sure, excellence and clear mind happened to be a vital credit in 2004 for the appointment of Mr. Giraud as the WMO Secretary General. He has led a fundamental management reform of the WMO Secretariat and brought significant excellence to the organization. This has been reflected in numerous areas, especially rebuilding confidence and trust in the WMO, along with the recognition of the WMO as a model organization and having an authoritative voice in the UN system. He has frequently been asked for advice, as for insurance, as for instance, a code of ethics and financial disclosure, even by much higher sister organizations. Mr. Giraud significantly contributed to the emphasis on the climate issues, in particular regarding Global Framework for Climate Services, GFCS, after the Third World Climate Conference in 2009, and the decision of the GFCS set up by the first and unique extraordinary Congress of the WMO. It was a joke. It was said, what was the Congress? It was extraordinary. And he continuously expressed the organization in numerous summits and high-level meetings. Mr. Giraud was a member of the Chief Executive Board of the United Nations, chair of UN Water, and still is a member and honorary member of several meteorological societies. Mr. Giraud left behind really impressive activities. He visited, just to say, 145 countries, met over 100 heads of states and governments, worked directly with the 3 UN Secretary Generals, participated in 26 chief executive boards on the UN and 7 WMO congresses, along with hundreds of presentations. Without doubt, Mr. Giraud has made a difference, not only in the WMO Secretariat, but also in the wider WMO community. Michel finalized his outstanding mission as the WMO Secretary General on the 31st of December 2015. Personally, I had a privilege of expressing the voice of the ERA 6 members and what was unanimously accepted during the 17th WMO Congress to award Michel with the honorary title as the Secretary General Emeritus. Today, I'm very pleased to identify Mr. Michel Giraud as the laureate of the EMS Silver Medal for 2016. Thank you.
Now. Okay, thank you, Ivan. Much appreciated for this laudatio. And now is the time, Michel, just to hand over the certificate and the medal.
And we are on the right thing?
I'm not sure. I have to read this now. You can read it together. The silver medal is awarded by the European Meteorological Society to Michel Giraud for significant scientific contributions to the establishment, for significant scientific contributions to the establishment of spectral methods in numerical weather prediction, his leading role in developing the World Meteorological Organization into the recognized authority about weather, climate and water within the United Nations system, and his part in the development of several major initiatives, in particular the launching of the Global Framework for Climate Services. Signed, Horst Böttger.
Oh, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
You have to look this way and that way, both. But there's a medal coming. That easily falls out, so I have to be careful.
Okay.
He does that all the time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I?
You ask the talk now?
If you say so, I'm certainly very, very happy. And first of all, thank you very much to all of you for being here. Thank you to the EMS for this great honor. I'm really honored to get that. Horst, as president, I've known you for 37 years, and I'm particularly pleased that you are the one to give me this honor. Ivan, thank you so much for these very, very nice words. I've known Ivan for a bit less than Horst, but still for a significant amount of time. And Ivan, we have interacted on so many issues. I feel also very, very pleased that you delivered this laudatio. So I was asked to present a lecture. I understand it's traditional. Maybe this is the privilege of age to talk about the future, but as a former forecaster, I know how difficult it is to predict the future. So I'm not going to make any prediction, but I want to reflect a little bit on a few things and to mention a few things which I believe may be important in the future. And to start with this reflection, I will go back, don't worry, very briefly in the past. I will go back a long time back, but I will go back about 3,000 years back, maybe a bit less, because some of the lessons of the time are still very much valid. When we refer to Aristotle, at that time, meteorology was not a science. It was a branch of knowledge. And often it was, and it is to some extent still linked to religious issue. How often do you hear, when you have survey, do you believe or not in climate change? It's not a matter of faith now. It should not be, this question should not be asked any longer. And that's why we still have to learn from the past and the progress that we made in how to address some of these issues. A key thing, and I think the lessons are still valid for the future, was what happened in the 17th, 18th century, where really scientific methodology was introduced. And we were, as we still are, one of the disciplines at the leading edge of scientific approach. It was one of the first really scientific approach to any discipline when Descartes introduced a scientific methodology, and that was almost immediately one of the applications was in meteorology. He himself was involved in quite a few meteorological applications. The development of instruments was key. It is still key, and I'm happy to see the exhibition and many presentations dealing with instruments. We still need more precise, better, wider observation for many parameters. Let me skip very, very briefly. 19th century was a turning point, and we are still benefiting from what happened. Meteorology became a science. The realization that we need to do it together, whatever the country, to coordinate, to have standards, led to the creation of the IMO, the International Meteorological Organization. And the first application came almost immediately. Marine was, of course, one of the early ones, but agriculture was also one of the very, very early ones. And that's why I'm very happy with the emphasis on biometeorology as well. It was... Now, I promise to be very quick, this historical, and my purpose is not to give a history lesson, but just to show that if you think back, what happened in the first half of the 20th century, meteorology was at the real leading edge of using new technology, using these new things called airplanes. Now we're in Italy, where the Med Service is under is run by the Air Force. It was really leading technology, telecommunication, radio sounds. So that led to the birth of what we call now modern meteorology. It also laid the foundation for the free exchange of observation across all countries. That was laid in the first half, well, actually in the last part of the 19th century and developed fully into the 20th century. The global cooperation strengthened enormously, but we saw the limits of, it was a non-governmental organization, the IMO, and there were limits because decisions at some stage had to be taken by governments and they had to be binding, they had to be implemented in all countries. So the second half of and now some of you in the room, not the younger generation, can relate to the early development, but the second half saw the creation of WMO as an intergovernmental organization, and it saw this explosion of technical progress, supercomputers, telecommunication, radar, satellite, and more than ever, we were at the leading edge. ECMWF was the first organization to use a Cray 1 computer. It was the first one to have a Cray XMP with 2 processors in Europe. It was the first one to have a Cray XMP with 4 processors. Maybe now it is not the stronger, but still we need ever more powerful computer. We are not yet at the point where we can say we have enough. We were certainly not at that point. And we are, sometimes I think we are too modest. We are too modest, but if you think about the progress of meteorology in the second half of the 20th century, I think, honestly, that numerical weather prediction in particular was one of the biggest success stories in all scientific disciplines. It is absolutely fascinating if you look backwards 50, 60 years. Meteorology is now what should be called big science. explosion of application, which were linked to the incredible progress made on the quality of the forecast. You have seen this graphic many, many times. This is from ECMWF, but it's spectacular progress over the last 30, 40 years. But cooperation is more vital than ever. You know, I'm very worried in a sense. I gave a lecture for the 40th anniversary of ECMWF not long ago, last year. And I said I was worried because if it was to be decided now, I believe ECMWF would not be created. Would not be created because we talk more about networks, something. Sometimes it's still important to get people to work together in the same place, and this is a beautiful, a wonderful jewel in European cooperation. By the way, so is EUMETSAT. So one of my messages is let's not believe that everything can be done just through network. It is also very important. Both are complementary approaches. But then, you remember my last, my slide for the last part of the first half of the 20th century, the limits of the NGO nature of IMO. Now we are reaching the limits of the intergovernmental approach for many of these organizations, because actors, decision makers now are not only government. Government remain still a very important position, but it has to go beyond that, and I will come back to that in some of the future slides. So now let's move to the context. 21st century, we have a very special context at the beginning of this century. Socioeconomic context, most activities, most human activities are weather or climate sensitive. The vulnerability to extreme events is growing, is increasing dramatically. The economic impact, I will show a slide later, of extreme events is growing dramatically. The demographic evolution is certainly something which sometimes is almost like a taboo issue. Sometimes it's impossible to discuss that in some of the international forum. It is an important issue. We cannot deal with sustainable development if we don't also address that part. Urbanization is also a new element of the context. All these can be threats, they can be problems, they can be opportunities as well, like urbanization. We are living in a context where we don't have only one major crisis. Right now we have a multiplicity of crises, which, by the way, interact with each other. Economic crisis, financial crisis. From time to time, you see the food crisis coming back. Right now, we don't talk very much about it, but all the ingredients are in place for the next one. So there will be a next food crisis. We have regularly health crisis, and sometimes people say, well, maybe they are not linked to climate, like the Ebola crisis. But you saw that Ebola, if you live in a country where it's very hot, very humid, some people may be tempted not to put the protective gloves. And I was told, for example, by the director of the Guinea Med Service, that the weather was a significant element in the propagation of the thing, because it would have been probably different if the climate was different in that country. The refugees, clear links also with the climate. We have a multiplicity of crises, and the climate, the weather, are very important elements of these crises. I mentioned disaster. You have seen that one, I think, in the presentation by Petri Talas on the first day, the strategic. It was not exactly the same one, but the message was more or less the same. Over the last 50 years, we are saving more and more lives. Definitely, early warnings are effective. We are saving more lives, but at the same time, the economic cost of disaster is exploding. And what is not shown on this graphic is that the economic cost may be in absolute terms much bigger in developed countries, but in relative terms, it is the least developed countries which are affected most compared to their GNP. You can have disaster which wipe out within a few hours, like a hurricane, which can wipe out up to 20-25% of the GDP of the country within a few hours. So it takes time to recover from that. That you have seen. You are very familiar with this one, so I will not say much about it. The climate is changing. There were lots of discussion about the pause. There was never any pause in the climate. There's variability, but the climate is changing, and we have to do that, and there's urgency to act. let me skip this one for the sake of time. 2015 was really an exceptional year for all these global issues. It started in Japan in March, with the countries of the planet unanimously agreeing on a framework for disaster reduction. That's called the Sendai Framework, which sets the scene for disaster prevention for the next 15 years. Countries of this planet also adopted, and if you think about it, it was remarkable. It took 45 seconds in New York to get a unanimous agreement on the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. Of course, before these 45 seconds, there were years of negotiation. But still, the outcome was there. The countries have now set the framework for the next 15 years about sustainable development and looking at all the pillars. We used to think of the 3 pillars, social, economic, environment, but now it's really even more holistic approach to this, where you have 17 goals, you have I think 169 targets dealing with all the key issues which will have to be dealt with in theory for the next 15 years, but it will certainly, I believe, set the scene for much, much longer than that. And again, unanimous, remember, unanimous agreement. Now the problem is about implementation. In Addis, in Ethiopia, in July, there was, maybe this one didn't get much publicity. It was a very important meeting which talked about financing for development. Where can we identify the money? How much will it cost? What should be the mechanism for that? Also, very important element of this year, exceptional year 2015. And last but not least, the COP21 and the Paris Agreement in December. Often you know how the United Nations system works. It works by consensus. So to get a consensus is not easy. And many people say that by almost construction, to get an agreement by consensus means you get at least the lowest common denominator. Paris was the beautiful counterexample to that. Paris was not the lowest common denominator. Paris is an ambitious agreement. Paris was approved by all the countries. Now the challenge, and that's a challenge of Marrakesh, is about implementation of the Paris Agreement, because we're still a fairly long way from the pledges right now are a long way for meeting the commitments. But definitely the dynamics has changed dramatically. If I go back a little bit on the Sendai framework, because it has, I know it's very important for our community, and there were several sessions talking about it, including one yesterday. There is an increased emphasis not only on prevention, and of course we should be happy that we put more emphasis on prevention and hopefully saving a lot of resources from rehabilitation later. Emphasis on resilience is a new very important word, especially if we connect it to the climate change issue, but also emphasis on multi-hazard. Although some of the hazards may look unconnected, there's a lot of synergy which can be gained from dealing with them in a multi-hazard fashion, and to put much more emphasis on not only the prediction of the strength of the wind, the amount of precipitation, but about the impact of these things. So definitely things are changing. Another key word is about building back better. And that part of the funds for reconstruction should be allocated to prevention, that you should include prevention issue into the reconstruction. A good example of that is what's happening right now in Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, where after the typhoon, reconstruction was not allowed within X meters. Don't ask me what X is, I've forgotten. X meters from the coast, to take into account the higher sea level. Of course, it could go even further than that, to take into account not only what has increased now, but what is anticipated from future climate change based, for example, on the IPCC scenarios. So it is now a completely different philosophy about it, and in this philosophy, you are not alone. You are not alone, and things should be done in very close cooperation with all the other actors at the national level, at the local level, but also at the international level. Now, Paris conference. I also want to say a few words because I think they are important for what will happen in the future. There was in the negotiation a key role of the scientific information. For the first time, I've attended many COPs. I've stopped counting how many COPs I've attended. But it's the first time that there was really no challenging of the scientific information provided. Of course, the basis was the IPCC fifth assessment report, but also all the other additional information which was provided, for example, by WMO, the latest information about 2015 being the warmest year, about greenhouse gas concentration, about extreme events, but also the information provided by the World Bank about the link with the economics, the report of the World Bank about the cost and the benefits of acting or not acting, the reports by UNEP about the adequacy of commitment versus what is required. So this was really taken as the basis for negotiation. Actually, it went even further than that. I'm sure several of you were in Paris in the negotiation, and you could see that the negotiators were really coming to scientific technical organization to ask for advice. For example, this request for 1.5 degree report by IPCC, there was question, is it still feasible? Is it still? So it was very important that the negotiator turned to our community as a source of advice, as a source of information. And we managed that because we have always been inflexible on the fact that the information provided was always the best possible one. We never tried to fall into the trap of, at least through the IPCC report and the WMO reports, of trying to exaggerate the issue. Actually, if we can be criticized, is for being maybe a little bit too cautious. So I was very, very encouraged by that. So the agreement I mentioned is ambitious. It is sort of binding, depending how there were lots of discussion, what you mean by binding. But what was new is that there was these voluntary pledges by countries which will be reviewed every 5 years, but they cannot be renewed down. They can be renewed only up. And there will be monitoring and verification. And that will ensure transparency for that. We shall have to play a big role because countries say, how do you check? How do you check that country? And this is where many of the projects underway will ensure that there is a right credibility on this verification mechanism. But both for adaptation and for mitigation, there will be the need for more information, for climate services. And this is where the GFCS becomes more important than ever. We shall need, it's going to be a top priority for, not most, for all National Weather Service to develop climate services, but not alone, in cooperation with all the other national and institutions involved in that. Another mechanism which was, another decision which was confirmed in Paris is about the loss and damage mechanism. It was a highly sensitive, politically sensitive thing. And for that one of the key challenge will be, for us, our contribution will be on the attribution. And that's going to be a very tricky issue. And there are many more actors. It's not only governments. There are many, many actors involved in that. On the GFCS, I tried to highlight just a few. I'm not going to go to any detail. Actually, I would be quite fast. I just wanted to highlight here the necessity of working together with many other partners. Some of them we have a long tradition of working together, like with the FAO, but some others we don't have a long tradition of working together. Most of the organizations at the international level after the Second World War were created by sectors. You had WMO dealing with meteorology, WHO dealing with health, FAO dealing with agriculture, and so on. Now we need cross-cutting issue. We need cooperation. We need to manage this this very tricky interaction between the various sectors. And if you look at the agenda 2030, the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, you have here the list of 17. Actually, some of them are directly related to WMO and to your activities, like the one 13. Goal 13 is the one on the climate. You have goal 6 on water, water and sanitation. You have a disaster which appears under 11 communities, sustainable cities, but it covers also disaster in non-urban environment. You could look almost at any of these goals: hunger, health, education, and so on, poverty reduction. For all of them, we have a contribution, and all of them are interacting with each other. They're not separate. All of them will require a cross-cutting approach. So the agreement was unanimous. The dimension now, it's encompassing many more things, and you may remember that they built upon what was called the Millennium Development Goal, the MDG. But the MDG were focusing on reducing inequalities, addressing the problem in particular of developing countries, let's say reducing by half the number of people who don't have access to safe drinking water and so on. Here, it goes much further. It's about leaving no one behind. It's not about reducing by half. It's about leaving no one behind. It is a transformative, it is an inclusive agenda, and it is of concern to both developing and developed country. And it requires engagement of non-state actors, civil society, cities, region, private sector. Of course, here we have a mix also of people from med service and communication. Communicators will have a key role in that issue. So it is a different way to do business, and that is setting the scene for what we need to do in the next decades. So we should not reinvent the wheel. Member States spend enormous amount of energy to agree on that, and it is unanimously agreed. It is our feuille de route, it is our mandate for the next probably 20, 30 years. So we should take that into account, and that will help us to convince government about funding your activities. Why? Because you can say, this is contributing to the big picture, and explain how, with details, how it does contribute to the big picture. But there are many, many challenges. As I said, most, actually all, the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, are cross-cutting. And okay, the cartoon is just about the illustration of matrix management. And many organizations were designed with specific things in mind. So we do not have the culture to cooperate sometimes with other partners. Just to take one example, you know still how difficult it is to get physical climate scientists and economists to work together. It is still a challenge. It is a very complex matrix to manage, but we need to have more integrated management of some key issues. It is one area where I would caution about trying to be perfect. It is almost a classical example where perfection would be a terrible enemy of good. Because if you try to do everything perfect, the cost would be just so enormous. It is important to identify what are the key areas where you get a benefit. When you coordinate things, it has a cost, it has a benefit. If the cost is bigger than the benefit, honestly, I don't care about duplication. I don't care. But if the cost is much less than the benefits, let's do it. So let's not try to be perfect. Let's just try to be effective. And the current, often recommended, if you look at management books, I'm sorry, most of them don't apply to that. You have very few management books which deal with this complex issue. Actually, maybe it's a challenge for those of you who are interested by that. You see, what I'm dreaming of is that some young people in university who have done both a bit of economics and a bit of mathematics would develop a fuzzy concept of, you know, the fuzzy theory in mathematics. It's a very interesting thing where things don't fully belong to anything. It also belongs to things, a certain probability of belonging to things. We need to invent new concept of management to adapt to these, to manage this new concept. Decision making doesn't easily take into account long time scales. Often people like yes, no, and you see maybe is an increasing, and maybe with different probabilities. So decision-making has to change. The paradigm for decision-making has to change for many, many sectors. Some of them are doing better than others. The past is increasingly misleading as a predictor for the future because of climate change. You have conflicting cost-benefit analysis, because if you ask energy people to make a cost-benefit analysis of managing a dam, they may come up with a very different answer from farmers or from some other people. So you need again to have a higher level view of that, which means that decisions have to be taken, some of them at a higher level. It's not about delegating decision to a lower level. For some, it's very effective, but for some big issues like climate, some decisions have to be delegated, have to be made at a higher level. I know it, again, it goes against the current trend for many management things. You have a multiplicity of decision makers and actors. So, sorry, they have to look forward. They have to get together, and let me check if I. Yeah, okay. I will talk about it in this slide. This is not a cartoon talking about the complexity of the intergovernmental system. Probably WMO is somewhere there. It's too small, you cannot see it, but I'm sure WMO is somewhere here. It's a complex system, and this system requires. It is still necessary. You still need a strong intergovernmental system, but it is not sufficient any longer. You need to complement it with other processes. We need to review the decision-making process not only at the international level. Often, as Secretary of WMO, was approached by member states to say, you should coordinate better, you should do that, you should do that. I said, yes, sure. By the way, how do you do it at the national level? And the same coordination has to be mapped at different decision level. Otherwise, it's like a chain. It's only as strong as its weakest link. So yes, we need to improve this decision-making process, but at all appropriate level. And we need to involve all the stakeholders. Not only government, civil society, local authorities, private sector, local, national, regional, international level. And that's probably one of the most difficult. We need to devise new mechanisms for transboundary governance. Most of the international governance is not really, it's not binding. You cannot force countries to do it. But if you look at water management, for example, in a big river basin, you cannot do it without having some international governance of the water. And that's tricky at the national level. It's even more difficult at the international level. So there are very specific challenges for us. From knowledge to action, meteorology, climatology, I'm preaching to the converted, I'm sure they are called to play an increasing role in the decades to come. In this room, we all agree. The problem is outside of this room. And almost all the challenges I've mentioned earlier have also their translation for our own community, for national meteorological, hydrological services, for the academic sector, for the private sector. So our community needs to get much more forcefully out of its box. I would be a bit critical, but in a sense, this critics is not against you. It's also a self-criticism. Our community is very much introvert still, and we need to get out of our box much more forcefully. We need to continue to get information in an authoritative way. We have done that. We need to continue, but in a more understandable way. Often, again, getting out of our box is necessary. We have not got the message in a way which can be easily used or even understood by the people who get the message. We need to strengthen communication. We need to strengthen cross-disciplinary cooperation. Again, I know in many countries, when you have young students, many of them tend to specialize more and more at an early stage. We are living in a world where we need more and more people who can understand many disciplines. I was very pleased by the background of Mr. Trump. You mentioned his background. We need really more people who get interest in several disciplines. We need to be much more proactive. We know whether we like it or not, doesn't make any difference. There will be development in terms of geoengineering. We are not ready. The problem is that some things may happen while the science doesn't have the answer yet. We need, by avoiding the scientific issue, it doesn't mean we shall avoid the problem. So we need to invest more in research so that if at some stage some people, some countries want to make silly decisions, at least we can, oh, sorry, let me put this way, want to make decision, we should make sure that these decisions are not silly, that they are based on the best possible information. And we need to develop partnership. I mentioned that many times, and you see I'm mentioning here again with the private sector. They are not competitors, they are not enemies, they are partners, we need to work with them. Capacity development, we still have a long way to go. We have a long way to go, and many med services, I'm aware of at least 2 or 3 med services on this planet who in 5 years from now will have 0 metrologists. Can you imagine? If I'm being asked by my government to run an hospital and I don't have any single medical doctor, I would say I cannot do it. If I was the director of a med service and being asked by the government, can you run a med service without a single metrologist? Sorry, I don't know how to do that. I just don't know how to do that. And you don't find metrologists on the market. As you know, it takes time to train them to... So we need to put more emphasis on capacity development. We need to be more innovative in terms of financing. But something which we have not addressed enough so far is the question of equity amongst communities, amongst generations, amongst countries. We need to include more the concept of solidarity in these things. We need to share knowledge. Actually, we're not bad at that, but we need to do even better. And please, by looking at these new challenges, do not forget the old challenges. Sometimes I was frightened to death by some comments it was in the COP before Paris. And someone said, the science has spoken. I said, yes, I'm very happy with that. I'm very happy that you are listening to the message of the science. But I said, the science is not, we have not finished to speak. We still have many questions which are not yet answered. So we should not say, now the 5th assessment report by IPCC is beautiful, we don't need to invest any longer in research. No, sorry, we need to invest even more. There are many answers that we need to provide. And last, I'm coming to the end, I hope I was not too long, the ethical issue. The ethical issue is getting much more serious. Regularly, you see for other disciplines, but I'm sure our discipline is not immune to that, this forgery, this thing. We need to be absolutely strict about the integrity of scientific research. I think the IPCC process is a very good process to assess the thing, because all the scientists involved in it can be involved in the process. The process, very interestingly enough, as you know, is reviewed, is endorsed by government. But if there's disagreement, the government don't have the final say. The scientists have the final say. It's unique. I think there are many lessons to be learned from that, and it gives a lot of weight to the authority of that. We should not compromise with that. We should not compromise with the integrity of the information provided. But we need also to think more about the people who are going to use this information. And the question of ethics, think about seasonal prediction, for example. It's complex. Ensemble prediction, it is complex. And the information provided by the leading centers of this planet will be more easily used by developed country. And you can imagine that this is at the expense of developing country, because they will have access to advanced information which they can use, for example, to buy in advance if they know that some crop is likely to be, etc., etc. So far, at least in my time in WMO, I never managed completely to convince people that it was a serious issue. I still believe we have to address that in the WMO context. We have to address this issue. So in insurance, I put it here not because of, okay, it's one of the application of metrology. I put it in liaison with the ethical issue, because you have also the situation where now it's almost impossible in some countries to get insurance because we know more about the development of the risk of extreme events. So I put the insurance here only in the context of the ethical issue. So we have the knowledge. Ignorance is no longer an excuse for inaction, and therefore we have urgency to act. So, concluding remarks, we have a huge responsibility. No other science, I'm serious about no other science, has such an impact on so many people and so many activities on a daily basis. It's a huge responsibility. And a fundamental principle should be global solidarity, our differences, I believe, are absolutely minuscule compared to the collective interests of mankind. So let's go beyond our individual, our national interests, and essential to keep a long-term vision. So crises really are not only challenges, they are also opportunities. Voilà. Merci in various WMO languages.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. The view from old WMO days as well.
Sorry?
The views obtained also from long time
That's
at WMO.
an ECMWF.
Yeah. Okay, you're happy to take
Yes, of course.
questions?
I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, let's see. Okay, Roberto.
Roberto.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. So one of the key issues, building on your last message, is providing access to data, to seasonal forecast.
Yeah.
So how do you think we can convince, especially European national med services and countries, to provide more open data access?
Actually, it's not only to provide data. You're right. This is important, but it's also to make sure that these data can be used as well. So it's not just making them available, but making sure that they can be used. Actually, if you go back, for example, before my time at WMO, I was at ECMWF, as many of you know, and this question was already around. So the challenge was at the time, and I'm sure it's still a question for ECMWF, is to make sure that there's still, of course, an incentive for countries to finance. So therefore, you have to show it's a win-win situation. And actually, the products which have been provided by ECMWF have increased over time. Maybe not, maybe they could have increased faster, but certainly they are increasingly being used in many other countries. ECMWF gets a feedback from that. It gets a benefit from that feedback. There's a number of cooperation, and I think that's usually the best way to convince people that you are able to show that everyone is winning from that. Actually, if I may extend beyond because in metrology, actually it's not too bad compared to some other things like hydrology. Hydrology is much, much worse in terms of exchange of data. And when you come to metrology, actually one thing that most countries have understood, and that was a big part of the thing leading to the agreement in 1995 of resolution 40 for the exchange of data, is that all countries are benefiting, even the biggest one, because even USA, China, Europe as a whole gets more out of the exchange than they put into the balance. And this is something which has worked not perfectly. It should be improved in metrology, but if you allow me, President, I would say that for me the biggest problem right now is in hydrology. In hydrology, there's no culture of exchanging data. Data are often managed in the best case at the basin level, and often countries within the same basin don't share data because it is seen as a strategic piece of information. And you can think of many basins where it happens. You can think of the Nile Basin. You can think of the Ganges Basin. You can think of many basins. And when the traditional approach by hydrologists is that if you want to manage water, if you are upstream, typically one of the use of water would be for energy production, building a dam. If you are downstream, it may be for irrigation, it may be for that. And you see the strategic approach, because the water that is used upstream, if you don't get it downstream, it can easily create tension across country. So how do you convince people countries. Let's take a very simple example, and it's not going to be politically sensitive because everyone knows it's difficult, between Ethiopia and Egypt about the Nile Basin. How do you convince both that it is in their interest to exchange data? Now, this is where climate comes into the picture. You cannot convince them just based on the water issue. It's impossible. But now we know that it's important to have this global exchange of hydrological data because of the climate issue. But you need to go one step further. It's not just a matter of saying it's going to be good for you, but concretely, what will you get? Which kind of products or services can be developed so that every country sees that although they may lose a little bit, they are going to gain a lot more. And I think this is the approach we should have, how to show it's a win-win situation. We have done it to a large extent in meteorology. Not enough, but much better than hydrology.
Okay, another question? It's also an issue of money, of course. And you mentioned the issue of capacity building, which is a buzzword, always used to be a buzzword at the WMO, is required. And then the next bullet says, but we need innovative funding.
Yes.
Which I found quite intriguing.
Yeah, because the way to finance organizations such as WMO, it's essentially money from governments. It's money which comes from central budget. At the national level, there's a diversity, of course, of models for the national med services. That you know, even in Europe, you know, there are very many different models for that. But there is a number of other actors who might be willing or would be willing to contribute, but in a different way. And when we talk about innovative funding, for example, okay, let me concentrate on the climate issue, because I will take just one example on the climate issue. You know that as part of the climate agreement, there's an agreement about this Green Climate Fund, which is, the Secretariat is in Korea. It is supposed to receive up to $100 billion per year from 2020 onwards. Right now, it is just over 10 billion altogether. But beyond the difficulty of making sure that the right amount of money comes into this fund, the question is, how do we make sure that some of this money goes not only to adaptation project, to build things, but that it goes to the med services, a little bit of it, so that it can strengthen the knowledge base for decision making. So that's one example on that, and we have been working a lot on that to make sure that med services can qualify, in particular connecting to the development of the global framework. Same for disaster prevention. After disaster, often there's huge amount of money for very limited amount of time coming after major disaster. Sometimes this amount of money is such that countries cannot even make use properly of this amount of money because everyone wants to help within a few weeks after the disaster. Now, let's make sure that a tiny fraction of that is invested in prevention, not only in rebuilding, but also in making sure that we minimize the risk. Now, back, and that will be my final, because I know I'm talking too much, my final comment on the Green Climate Fund. Where is the money coming from in the Green Climate Fund? Of course, government will contribute a significant amount, but it will also come from other sources. It can be a contribution from, even in different way, in innovative way, from the private sector. You see, groups like the insurance or the reinsurance company are very sensitized to this question because for them it's also part of their business. They want to know more. It's important for them that they know what will happen. It can be also some local, some cities, some regions are willing to invest in that, are willing. Some of the money may not be directly going to the Green Climate Fund in Korea, but it may be in projects which are recognized, which are approved as contributing to that. This is what is meant by innovative. We cannot stay in the traditional model where only government finance all these issues.
Okay, thank you, Michel. I think we have come to the end of the discussion, the end of the session. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thanks.
And well done. Okay, Victor. All right. I think we have a coffee break, is that right? And then, okay.